my beloved child. Stop scrolling for just a moment, because something is waiting for you inside these words, and the timing of this message is not as random as it may seem. There are moments when heaven allows two paths to cross without warning, moments that look ordinary from the outside but carry a revelation powerful enough to change what someone believes about you. And today, I want you to imagine one of those moments. Your soulmate was not expecting it. They were not searching for an answer about you. They were not sitting somewhere thinking, I wonder what happened to the person I still cannot forget. They were simply moving through an ordinary moment when a familiar face appeared. A person who knows you. A person who has seen a side of you that your soulmate has never witnessed. A person who knows something about your journey that you never explained. And what happened next left your soulmate completely stunned. Pause here for a moment, because the first thing you need to understand is this: sometimes the answer you have been waiting for does not arrive through a message, a phone call, a confession, or a dramatic reunion. Sometimes it arrives through another person. Sometimes heaven places the right person in the right place at the exact moment when someone's heart is finally ready to hear the truth. And your soulmate heard something about you that they were not prepared for. At first, they probably thought it was just casual conversation. A simple greeting. A few familiar words. Perhaps they recognized the person immediately, but they did not yet realize how deeply connected that person was to your story. Maybe they smiled politely. Maybe they asked how things were going. Maybe they mentioned your name without even realizing how much that name still carried inside your soulmate's heart. And then something changed. The conversation became different. The atmosphere shifted. Because your name came up. Not because your soulmate asked. Not because they were trying to find information. Your name simply entered the conversation. And the moment they heard it, something inside them became alert. They listened differently. They stopped pretending they were unaffected. They became curious. Because there are certain names that do not sound like ordinary names when spoken by someone who has been carrying unfinished feelings. Your name was one of those names. And the person standing in front of them knew it. They could see the reaction. They could see the hesitation. They could see the tiny change in your soulmate's expression. Perhaps your soulmate tried to hide it. Perhaps they looked away. Perhaps they laughed as though the subject did not matter. But the person who knows you noticed. And that person said something your soulmate did not expect. Something that made them realize they had been looking at your story from the wrong direction. Something that made them question the assumptions they had carried for far too long. Because, my beloved child, your soulmate believed they knew what happened. They believed they understood why things became complicated. They believed they understood your silence. They believed they understood your distance. They believed they knew what you felt. But they did not have the whole story. They had pieces. Fragments. Moments taken out of context. Words they remembered differently. Things they assumed instead of things they actually knew. And sometimes one missing piece can completely change the meaning of an entire story. That is what this unexpected conversation began to do. It started putting the missing pieces back together. Your soulmate may have heard that you were not the person they had imagined you became. They may have heard that the silence they interpreted as rejection was actually connected to something much deeper. They may have heard that there were moments when you wanted to reach out but chose not to because you did not want to disturb their life. They may have heard that you carried more pain than you ever showed. But that was only the beginning. Because the person who knows you did not simply describe what you went through. They revealed something about who you became afterward. And that was the part that truly stunned your soulmate. You changed. Not in the way they imagined. You did not become colder because you stopped caring. You became quieter because you learned that not every feeling needs to be announced. You did not disappear because you forgot. You stepped back because you were trying to find yourself again. You did not stop loving because you became indifferent. You stopped chasing because you finally understood your worth. And when your soulmate heard that, something inside them became painfully quiet. Because suddenly they remembered moments they had misunderstood. They remembered your expression. They remembered the way you used to listen. They remembered the things you never said. They remembered the last conversation that ended differently than they expected. They remembered your eyes. They remembered the pauses. They remembered the moments when you seemed as though you wanted to say something but changed your mind. And suddenly those memories looked different. Have you ever looked back at a moment years later and realized you completely misunderstood it? That is what began happening inside your soulmate. The past was replaying itself. But this time, they were seeing it through a different lens. The conversation continued. The person who knows you began sharing little details. Not secrets meant to expose you. Not private information meant to embarrass you. But truths that your soulmate had never known. They learned that you had been fighting battles quietly. They learned that you had gone through moments when you could have become bitter, but somehow you kept moving. They learned that you had opportunities to speak badly about them but chose not to. And that detail struck deeply. Because your soulmate may have believed that you were angry. They may have believed that you blamed them. They may have believed that somewhere in your heart you wanted them to suffer for what happened. But instead, they heard something completely different. They heard that you still spoke about them with a strange tenderness. Not obsession. Not desperation. Not bitterness. Tenderness. And that frightened them more than anger ever could. Because anger would have been easier to understand. Anger would have given them a reason to stay away. But hearing that you had no desire to destroy their image, even after everything, forced them to confront something uncomfortable. Perhaps you had grown beyond the version of yourself they remembered. Perhaps you had healed. Perhaps you had learned how to love without begging. Perhaps you had learned how to miss someone without losing yourself. And suddenly your soulmate wondered whether they had lost something rare. Not something perfect. Something real. That question stayed with them. Even after the conversation ended. Even after they walked away. Even after they tried to return to their normal routine. The words followed them. Because the person who knows you said one particular thing that your soulmate could not forget. They said, in their own way, that you were never as weak as you appeared. You were simply tired. And those two things are completely different. You were not incapable of fighting. You were exhausted from fighting everything alone. You were not without confidence. You were learning to rebuild confidence after being disappointed. You were not silent because you had nothing to say. You were silent because you had already said enough and realized that being understood could not be forced. Your soulmate heard this and suddenly felt something they had been avoiding. Regret. Not necessarily regret for loving you. Regret for misunderstanding you. Regret for assuming. Regret for waiting. Regret for allowing distance to become normal. Regret for believing that because you stopped reaching out, your feelings must have disappeared. And perhaps the hardest realization of all was this. You had stopped chasing them without stopping your heart from caring. That distinction changed everything. Because your soulmate had expected time to erase you. They expected distance to weaken the connection. They expected you to move forward so completely that eventually there would be nothing left between you. But what they heard suggested something different. You had moved forward. You had grown. You had changed. But the chapter had never received the ending they thought it had. And now your soulmate was left wondering whether the door they thought was permanently closed had simply been waiting for the right moment to open. My beloved child, I want you to understand the emotional weight of this fictional spiritual story. It is not about guaranteeing what another person is secretly thinking. It is not about telling you to wait endlessly for someone. It is not about convincing you that every coincidence is a supernatural promise. It is about something deeper. It is about the possibility that people can misunderstand each other, separate while still caring, and eventually discover truths that were hidden behind silence. And sometimes the greatest revelation is not that someone misses you. It is that someone finally understands you. That is what this encounter represents. Understanding. Your soulmate heard something that forced them to reconsider the story they had built in their mind. And once a story changes, emotions change with it. They began thinking about you differently. They started wondering where you were. What your life looked like now. Whether you were happy. Whether you had changed. Whether someone else had entered your life. Whether you still remembered them. But there was one question that became louder than all the others. What if I misunderstood them? That question can be heavier than any declaration of love. Because if your soulmate had truly misunderstood you, then some of the choices they made may have been based on a false belief. And now they had information that challenged that belief. They could not simply forget it. They could not pretend they never heard it. The person who knows you had spoken with a calm certainty that made the words feel believable. They did not sound like someone trying to create drama. They sounded like someone who had watched your journey from a distance. Someone who knew the version of you that existed when nobody was watching. And that is why your soulmate listened. Because people can lie about what they feel. People can exaggerate. People can create stories. But someone who has actually witnessed your character can sometimes say a single sentence that carries more weight than 100 explanations. And that is exactly what happened. Your soulmate heard about a moment from your past. A moment they never knew about. A moment that changed the way they understood your decisions. Perhaps it was a time when you were hurting and still showed kindness. Perhaps it was a moment when someone encouraged you to move on, and you tried. Perhaps it was a moment when you had every reason to speak against your soulmate but refused. Whatever the detail was, it created a crack in the wall your soulmate had built. And through that crack came memories. One after another. They remembered the small things. The things nobody else would remember. The way you looked at them when they were talking. The way you noticed details other people ignored. The way you tried to make them comfortable. The way you sometimes became quiet when something mattered too much. The way you could laugh even when something was weighing on you. The way you seemed stronger than you actually felt. And suddenly your soulmate understood something. You had been communicating more through your behavior than through your words. They simply did not know how to read it at the time. That realization hurt. But it also awakened something. Curiosity. Not ordinary curiosity. The kind that makes someone search through old memories. The kind that makes someone open an old conversation and stare at a message without sending anything. The kind that makes someone wonder what would happen if they heard your voice again. And perhaps that is where the night became even more intense. Because after the encounter ended, your soulmate was alone. The noise around them disappeared. No one was watching. No one was asking questions. There was no reason to pretend. And that was when the truth they had been avoiding became impossible to ignore. They missed you. Not the idea of you. Not merely the memories. You. The person you are now. And they realized they knew almost nothing about that person. They knew an older version of you. A version shaped by circumstances they no longer understood. They began wondering what you had become. Had you become happier? Stronger? More peaceful? Had you learned to trust yourself? Had you stopped waiting? Had you finally let go? That last question hurt the most. Because if you had truly let go, then perhaps the opportunity they once had was no longer available. And suddenly the possibility of losing you permanently became real. This is where the emotional story turns. Because until that moment, your soulmate may have believed they had unlimited time. They may have assumed that if they ever wanted to return, you would still be somewhere waiting. But now they began to realize something. You were not waiting. You were living. You were continuing. You were becoming someone they could no longer assume would remain emotionally available forever. And strangely, that realization did not make them want to run. It made them want to know the truth. They wanted to know whether the person they remembered still existed. They wanted to know whether your heart had completely closed. They wanted to know whether the feelings between you had ever been real from your perspective. And most of all, they wanted to know what you had never told them. Because the person who knows you had hinted at something. Something they had not fully explained. Something that made your soulmate stop and ask, "What do you mean?" The person hesitated. They looked at your soulmate. And then they said something that changed the entire conversation. They said that if your soulmate really wanted to understand you, they needed to stop judging your past behavior without knowing what you were carrying at the time. Your soulmate went silent. Because suddenly the conversation was no longer casual. It had become personal. Very personal. And the person continued. They explained that there were things you never told your soulmate because you did not want sympathy. You did not want to be rescued. You did not want anyone to feel sorry for you. You simply wanted to be understood. But when understanding did not come, you stopped explaining. That sentence landed heavily. Because your soulmate realized that your silence may never have been punishment. It may have been surrender. Not surrender to defeat. Surrender to reality. You had realized you could not force another person to understand what they were unwilling to see. So you stopped trying. And your soulmate suddenly wondered how many times they had mistaken your surrender for indifference. How many times had they seen your silence and thought, they don't care anymore? How many times had they protected their own pride because they believed you had already moved on? How many opportunities had been lost because two people were waiting for the other to make the first move? The questions began multiplying. And then came the revelation that truly stunned them. The person who knows you told them that there was something you once said. Something about your soulmate. Something you said when you thought nobody would ever repeat it. Your soulmate immediately asked what you had said. The person hesitated again. And for a few seconds, neither of them spoke. That silence carried more weight than the entire conversation. Because your soulmate knew instinctively that whatever came next would matter. They leaned in. They listened. And the person finally began to speak. They said that you never described your soulmate as the person who ruined your life. You described them as the person who taught you something you could never forget. Your soulmate was stunned. Because that was not the story they expected. They had expected anger. They had expected blame. They had expected you to say that you regretted everything. Instead, you had apparently spoken about the connection with gratitude. Not because it had been easy. But because it had changed you. Your soulmate suddenly realized that perhaps they had misunderstood the depth of your heart. Perhaps you had not been trying to erase them. Perhaps you had been trying to transform the pain into wisdom. And there was more. The person who knows you said you had once admitted that if you ever met your soulmate again, you would not ask them to explain the past. You would simply want to know whether they had changed. That sentence struck like lightning. Because your soulmate had changed. At least, they believed they had. But they had never considered that you might ask the same question. Not, do you still love me? Not, why did you leave? Not, do you regret it? But something far deeper. Who are you now? That question stayed inside them. Because love is not always about returning to where you left off. Sometimes love asks whether both people have become capable of creating something healthier than what existed before. And your soulmate began wondering whether they were ready for that. They thought about their mistakes. Their pride. Their hesitation. The moments when they could have reached out. The times they convinced themselves that silence was safer. The moments when they chose comfort over truth. And perhaps for the first time, they admitted something to themselves. They had been afraid. Afraid of rejection. Afraid that you had moved on. Afraid that you would ask questions they could not answer. Afraid that they would discover you no longer wanted them. And fear had disguised itself as indifference. That realization was painful. But it was also liberating. Because once someone identifies the truth behind their behavior, they can no longer hide behind the behavior itself. Your soulmate could no longer simply say, "It was complicated." They had to ask why they allowed it to become complicated. They could no longer say, "The timing was wrong." They had to ask why they never tried to create a better time. They could no longer say, "You stopped caring." They had to ask whether they had given you enough reason to keep showing your heart. And somewhere inside that reflection, something began to shift. The person who knows you noticed. They could see that your soulmate was no longer listening merely out of curiosity. They were listening because they were emotionally involved. So they asked a question. A simple question. Do you still care about them? Your soulmate did not answer immediately. That hesitation said everything. Because if the answer had been no, it would have been easy. No. One word. Finished. But they could not say it. Instead, they looked away. And the person who knows you waited. Finally, your soulmate admitted something quietly. They said they did not know. But perhaps that was not the truth. Perhaps they knew. Perhaps they simply did not know what to do with what they knew. There is a difference. And the person standing across from them understood it. They did not push. They did not tease. They did not turn the conversation into gossip. They simply said something that your soulmate would carry with them long after the encounter ended. They said, "Then stop pretending you don't." Those words became the emotional turning point. Because pretending had become exhausting. Pretending they did not wonder. Pretending they did not remember. Pretending they had moved on completely. Pretending that your name did not still create a reaction. Pretending that seeing someone who knows you did not suddenly reopen a door they had spent so long trying to keep closed. And when the conversation ended, your soulmate walked away carrying something they had not carried into it. Possibility. Not certainty. Not a promise. Possibility. The possibility that you had never hated them. The possibility that you had understood more than they realized. The possibility that your silence had not meant the end. And the possibility that if the two of you ever crossed paths again, the conversation could be completely different. But there was one final detail. One detail the person almost did not mention. They stopped your soulmate before they left. They said, "There is one more thing you should know." Your soulmate turned around. And suddenly the entire atmosphere changed again. Because the person who knows you had been holding something back. Something they had not wanted to reveal too quickly. Something that had been connected to you for a long time. They looked at your soulmate and said that you had changed more than anyone realized. But that was not the shocking part. The shocking part was what came next. They said that despite everything, there was one thing about your soulmate that you had never changed your mind about. Your soulmate stared at them. What? The person paused. And then they revealed that you had once described your soulmate in a way they never expected. You had said that beneath all the mistakes, beneath the distance, beneath the confusion, there was still a good heart. A heart you had seen before circumstances hardened it. A heart you had believed in even when you were disappointed. And your soulmate felt something break open inside them. Because perhaps they had spent years believing that you remembered them only for their failures. But now they were hearing that you remembered their goodness too. And that was harder to carry. Because when someone hates you, you can defend yourself. When someone blames you, you can argue. When someone walks away angrily, you can tell yourself they were emotional. But when someone sees your flaws and still remembers the good inside you, there is nowhere left to hide. Your soulmate became quiet. Very quiet. And the person who knows you noticed tears beginning to form in their eyes. Maybe they tried to hide them. Maybe they looked down. Maybe they laughed awkwardly. But the emotion was there. Because suddenly the person they thought had forgotten them had remembered them with compassion. And compassion can reopen doors that anger permanently closes. The conversation ended. But the story did not. That night, your soulmate returned home with your name following them through every room. They tried to distract themselves. They tried to act normal. They opened their phone. They looked through old conversations. They found an old photograph. Maybe they stared at it longer than they intended. Maybe they smiled. Maybe they felt pain. Maybe they whispered your name without realizing it. And then they reached a message they had not looked at in a long time. A message from you. Something ordinary. Something that once seemed insignificant. But now, after hearing the truth, it looked completely different. They read it again. And again. And suddenly they noticed the emotion hidden between your words. The care they had overlooked. The hesitation. The softness. The part of you that had been trying to remain strong. And your soulmate realized something heartbreaking. You had been giving them clues. They simply had not known how to read them. That realization kept them awake. Because now they had a choice. They could continue pretending. Or they could finally face the truth. And somewhere deep in the quiet of that night, they made a decision. Not necessarily to contact you immediately. Not yet. But to stop lying to themselves. They admitted that they still cared. They admitted that hearing about you had affected them. They admitted that they wanted to know whether there was still something between you. And then another thought entered their mind. What if you had someone else now? What if someone else knew the version of you they had failed to know? What if someone else was making you laugh? What if someone else was hearing your stories? What if someone else had become the person you trusted? That thought created a completely different emotion. Jealousy. But beneath the jealousy was fear. Fear of being too late. And that fear became stronger when they remembered the person's words. You are not the same people you were before. Your soulmate understood what that meant. If there were ever another chance, it could not be about recreating the past. It would have to be about meeting the new you. And perhaps that was the most beautiful part of this entire revelation. You were no longer the person who needed someone else to validate your worth. You had learned to stand alone. You had learned to stop begging for clarity. You had learned that love without respect could become a wound. You had learned that sometimes walking away is not giving up. Sometimes walking away is choosing yourself. And your soulmate was beginning to understand that. They were beginning to see the strength behind your silence. The strength behind your absence. The strength behind your refusal to chase. And strangely, that strength made them admire you more. They wondered whether they had underestimated you. Whether they had mistaken your softness for weakness. Whether they had assumed that because you loved deeply, you would always remain available. But you had grown. And growth changes the rules. The next morning, your soulmate woke up with the conversation still in their mind. The first thought was you. Not because they wanted it to be. Because something unresolved had been awakened. They replayed the encounter. Every word. Every pause. Every expression. Especially the final revelation. The thing you had once said. The fact that you still remembered their goodness. And then they asked themselves the question they had avoided for so long. If I had another chance, would I do it differently? The answer came faster than expected. Yes. But then came the harder question. Would they even let me? And that question had no easy answer. Because your soulmate did not know what you had become. They did not know how deeply you had healed. They did not know whether your heart had room for them. They did not know whether you would recognize the person standing in front of you if they returned. And that uncertainty became the beginning of something new. Not a reunion yet. Not a confession yet. Not an ending. A beginning. Because sometimes the first miracle is not bringing two people together. Sometimes the first miracle is making one person finally understand what they almost lost. And your soulmate had just received a glimpse of that understanding. But there was still something they did not know. The person who knows you had not told them everything. There was one more truth. A deeper truth. A detail that could explain why you disappeared when you did. A detail that could explain why you never reached out again. A detail that could completely change what your soulmate believed about the final chapter between you. And that person had almost revealed it. Almost. But something stopped them. Maybe they decided it was not their secret to tell. Maybe they believed your soulmate needed to discover it directly from you. Or perhaps they knew that if they revealed it now, the consequences would be too powerful. Your soulmate sensed that something was being withheld. They asked. What else do you know? The person looked at them. For a moment, they said nothing. Then they replied with words that sent a chill through your soulmate's heart. They said, there is something you need to hear, but I don't think I should be the one to tell you. Your soulmate asked why. The person simply answered. Because if you hear it from me, you may misunderstand it again. And then they walked away. Leaving your soulmate standing there with more questions than answers. What could possibly be so important? What had you never told them? Why had you chosen silence? Was there a reason you had walked away that had nothing to do with losing feelings? Was there something happening behind the scenes? Was there a moment your soulmate never knew about? A decision you made quietly? A sacrifice? A misunderstanding? A conversation? A truth someone else had hidden? The questions kept coming. And perhaps the greatest question of all was the one your soulmate was now too afraid to ask. What if they never stopped loving me? Because if that were true, then the years of distance would suddenly look very different. The missed opportunities would feel heavier. The silence would feel louder. And the possibility of another chance would become almost impossible to ignore. But heaven was not showing your soulmate the entire picture yet. Only pieces. Because sometimes revelation comes in stages. First, the heart must become willing to listen. Then the mind must become willing to question. Then the soul must become willing to accept what the ego refused to see. And your soulmate had just crossed the first threshold. They had listened. They had questioned. Now they were approaching the truth. Meanwhile, you were living your life without knowing that this conversation had happened. You were going about your day. You were thinking about your own responsibilities. You were healing in ways nobody could see. You were building a life that did not depend on whether someone returned. And that is precisely why the encounter mattered. Because you were not sitting somewhere trying to control the outcome. You were not forcing the universe to bring someone back. You were not begging heaven for a sign. You were becoming whole. And when you become whole, you stop needing another person to complete the story. You can welcome them if they come with truth. But you no longer abandon yourself to make them stay. That is the version of you your soulmate was beginning to discover. Not the old you. Not the wounded you. Not the waiting you. The healed you. The stronger you. The you who finally understands that love should meet you where you stand, not demand that you return to the place where you were hurt. And your soulmate could feel that difference without even seeing you. They could sense that something had changed. Because the person who knows you described you differently. They did not describe someone waiting. They described someone who had found peace. And your soulmate realized that if they ever approached you again, they would need to come with something more valuable than nostalgia. They would need honesty. They would need accountability. They would need courage. They would need to stop hiding behind circumstances. And that realization frightened them. But it also gave them hope. Because perhaps the door was not closed. Perhaps it simply required a different key. The key was not manipulation. Not jealousy. Not dramatic words. Not promises made in emotional moments. The key was truth. And there was still one truth your soulmate had not heard. The truth the person refused to reveal. The truth connected to the moment when you finally decided to stop waiting. The truth connected to the last time your name was mentioned in a conversation your soulmate never knew about. The truth connected to a decision you made quietly, without telling anyone. And when your soulmate eventually learns what happened, they may realize that the distance between you was never as simple as they believed. Because the story they carried for so long was missing a chapter. A chapter that could change everything. And that chapter begins with something you did when nobody was watching. Something you chose not to say. Something you chose to protect. Something that may have cost you more emotionally than your soulmate ever understood. The person who knows you knows what happened. Your soulmate does not. Not yet. And that is why the conversation could not end there. Because before your soulmate can decide whether to reach toward you again, they must first understand the sacrifice you made. They must understand why you walked away. They must understand what you were protecting. And most importantly, they must understand what you still carried in your heart after you left. Because the final truth is not merely about what happened between you. It is about why, after everything. Your name still had the power to stop your soulmate in the middle of an ordinary day. Why one unexpected conversation could shake years of certainty. Why one person saying your name could awaken memories they thought were buried. Why your silence suddenly sounded different. And why, despite everything they told themselves, your soulmate is now standing at the edge of a decision they never expected to face again. Do they leave the past where it is? Or do they finally search for the truth? And just when they thought they had heard everything, the person who knows you sends one final message. Not a long message. Not an explanation. Just a few words. Words that your soulmate reads once. Then twice. Then a third time. And suddenly their entire expression changes. Because the message contains your name. And beneath your name is a sentence that your soulmate never expected to see. A sentence that reveals the person who knows you has been carrying a truth about you for much longer than they realized. A truth about the last time you spoke about your soulmate. A truth about what you said when you believed nobody would ever find out. And my beloved child, that is where we must pause. Because the next part of this story is not about whether your soulmate remembers you. They do.it is not about whether the conversation affected them. It did. It is not even about whether they are questioning their past decisions. They are. The deeper question is what they discovered after reading those final words. Because what they learned about you was so unexpected that it forced them to reconsider not only the past, but the possibility of the future. They finally understood that the person they thought they had lost may never have been truly gone. And the revelation waiting beyond that message is even more powerful. Because the person who knows you is about to reveal why you disappeared, what you were protecting, and the one thing you never wanted your soulmate to know. And when your soulmate discovers that truth, they will have to face the question they have avoided for far too long. What if the person I was waiting for, was never waiting for me at all? The answer is closer than they realize. And when it finally comes, it will change the meaning of everything they thought they knew about you.